I'm Nazir Afzal, I'm Director of the Crown Prosecution Service in London. And I also have the National Lead for Honour-Based Violence and Forced Marriage. And honour killings or honour crimes there's lots of definitions, quite frankly, but the one I tend to use, it is simply about men controlling women's behaviour. And if women step out of line or are perceived to have stepped out of line, then they will suffer harm or the threat of harm. And that's basically what it is. I mean, it's convoluted, there are lots of government definitions, the police definitions, but I try to explain it in such a way that people understand it. Women are not allowed to do that, and if they do that, they will suffer. And that's basically the sort of definition that enables people to understand what we're looking for. We know that people, particularly women, are being forcibly imprisoned, they're being assaulted, they're suffering sexual assaults, they're suffering all sorts of violence in the home, threats. Some of them are simply being locked up and never being allowed out. Others are killing themselves, harming themselves. Others are being spirited out of the country and taken to places that they never knew. And so you can think of every variation you could think of in terms of criminal activity and criminal behavior I have seen in relation to people who are allegedly dishonouring their families. I come across the issue of this is just domestic violence very early on when I started talking about this subject, and I immediately rubbished it because all of honour-based violence that I have seen is organised. It's usually multiple offenders. It's usually premeditated, i.e., I think about it beforehand. It's not something that you spontaneously thought you could do something about. I can give you loads of examples of where, if they went away from a particular situation and thought about it and prepared and did something. That's not what happens in domestic violence. Domestic violence, the animosity, hostility grows from a particular incident and it's dealt with almost there and then. There's no real pre-planning. But honour-based violence and forced marriage is very often pre-planned. And also, unlike domestic violence, in the wider community, domestic violence is stigmatised. It's seen as a very bad thing. Whereas honour-based violence and forced marriage, there are too many supporters of it. And even if they're not supporters, through their silence, they're encouraging. I try to get them to realise that just sitting still and saying nothing gives people the opportunity to say, well, actually, nobody said it was wrong. Is it the makeup of people? Is it what they think and the way they've been growing up? And have they been thinking, this is cycles? Are we talking about cycles here? I.e., this is what my parents did to me and therefore I will carry on doing this? Is that part of it? I think it's much more complicated than that. I think that there have been one or two cases I've dealt with where I actually felt sorry for the perpetrator because when I investigated, or when the police investigated further, they realised actually that he was under pressure, that the community or members of the community were saying, are you going to allow your daughter to do this? Are you going to, will you be able to walk around the streets of wherever you are and do so in such a way that you can hold your head up high? And so he was put under pressure. He was almost like a victim in those circumstances where, obviously he has you have willpower and you should be able to stand up to that. But of course, if you're weak and people put pressure on you all the time, then perhaps you will not resist. So there's the community pressure. I dealt with a case of the murder of a young woman called Samara Nazir, and she was murdered in West London, not far from here, in fact. And a lot of people say to me that this issue of honour-based violence, etc., this is poor people, lack of education. These are people who don't know any better. In Samara's case, her family were extremely well educated. She'd been to university herself. The rest of the family, excellent business, lots of businesses, very wealthy. You'd imagine the kind of family that was established in this country. However, Samara decided that she wanted to marry somebody of her own choice. Her family didn't like the idea, and then she was slaughtered in the presence of two infant nieces who were covered with her blood. And from my point of view, it was easy to prosecute the 16-year-old cousin. They very often use the youngest member of the family to carry out the act, by the way, because they're likely to get the least sentence. They're also likely to lose least because they don't have a great deal. So it was very easy to prosecute the 16-year-old. He was covered in her blood. But it occurred to me, those of us who know this field, know that he couldn't have acted alone. So we had to build a strong case against other members of the family. And the only way we did that is by applying the kind of techniques that we use in organized crime, so mafia-type, drug-type crime, where you put listening devices in rooms and that kind of action. That's what you had to do in what you would, and some people might have thought was a domestic. It wasn't a domestic violence; it was an organized crime. And as a result of that, we were able to prosecute the brother, and he was convicted. The father would have been convicted, but he died before the jury returned their verdict. So, we recognized it was an organized crime. We treated it as an organized crime, and Samara died for nothing. And then you said to us, some people said, oh, there were some people talking about how the honor of the family had been restored by her death. You can go down Southall Broadway in West London, and you'll see their businesses are closed down. You'll see half the family are in jail, the other half are totally distraught. Well, you tell me where the honor in that is, So that, to my mind, is a case in point about it's not an issue of education, it's not an issue of standing in community. It can affect anybody and everybody. In Alicia Begum's case, Alicia was the youngest victim of an honour killing in this country. She was 6. And Alicia was murdered in the West Midlands, in the Midlands of this country. And she will never know why she died. Her house was burnt down by others acting on behalf of another family. 9 other members of her family managed to escape. Unfortunately, she didn't, and she had 80% burns and died. And when we investigated, the police investigated that case, they realized that, in fact, the motivation for the house being set on fire was the fact that her older brother, or one of her older brothers, was sending text messages to another girl. Now, you and I might think that's an overreaction. She's sending text messages are being received, so let's try and set fire to the house and kill 10 of them. It seems absolutely ridiculous. Unfortunately, Alicia was the victim of that. And the good news, I guess, is that not only did we convict the person who set fire to the house, that we know the others. We know that they are very keen to leave the country almost as soon as they carry out the act. But even though we don't have extradition treaties with a number of countries, the countries to where they go are so horrified by what's happened, they're more than happy to assist us in returning the people to face trial. So that's a good story. Sometimes the bizarre nature of the plot will make you laugh almost. Mr. Dosanjh was a Sikh man, and his daughter ran away with a Jewish man, and he couldn't find either of them. And so he decided that what he would do was he would arrange for a hitman. 1 in 9 honour killings in this country are carried out by hitmen, by the way. He would arrange for a hitman to kill the father of the boyfriend. And when he had done that, that would flush out his daughter and her boyfriend to the funeral, and then he'd have them killed too. Now, the good news, and there is good news, is that if you want a hitman in London, you'll get an undercover police officer. And so as a result of that, three lives were saved. He's now serving 14 years in jail. But, the extent he would go to for something that you and I might consider to be the most pettiest of reasons, just demonstrates the level of their involvement. The other thing I noticed, and not just about that case, but was when I talked about 1 in 9 killings are carried out by hitmen, in the last 5 years, I'm only aware of one case where a hitman was paid. All the hitmen are happy to do it. They believe in it. It's, if you want me to kill your daughter, I'll kill your daughter. I believe in what you want to do, and therefore I will help you do that. And that's the level of stupidity, I guess, but the brutality of it all, that they don't need the money. I don't want any money. I will do it for you anyway. And that really shocks me. But it's something that we're aware of, and so it's not a question of following the money trail sometimes. It's simply following the kind of organized crime techniques that we use in order to bring people to justice. We've got more sophisticated, and Banaz Mahmood was probably the case in point where things really went very badly. And Banaz was a Kurdish girl who she'd been through a forced marriage when she was 16, and she came out the other end beaten and bruised. But 2 years of that, and she managed to survive. But she's back at home, and Banaz found herself a new boyfriend. And one day she was kissing her boyfriend outside of a tube station. Unfortunately, another member of the Kurdish community saw her. That person, for whatever reason, decided to go home and tell her father and her uncle. Her uncle was always known as quite a brutal guy. And what he did then was to set up a meeting that evening where 8 men, including the father and the uncle, sat around a table, a normal dinner table, and decided that Banaz's crime was such that she must die. And a group of them decided how it would happen. The next day, she was abducted off the streets of London. One of the people that killed her raped her. Now, you talk about honour, I would have thought that was a rather dishonourable thing to do, but so be it. And then she was strangled and she was buried in a suitcase. Now, Banaz went to police a number of times before she was murdered to say that she was being threatened. And on one occasion, she was being plied with alcohol. Now, as a good Muslim girl, she didn't drink. So when she managed to realize that something was up, she managed to escape the house by smashing a window. The nearest police officer she went to thought that she was hysterical and decided that, in fact, she was lying, that it's very likely that she should be prosecuted herself for damaging the window. And so basically returned her to the home. So there were opportunities to intervene in Banaz's case which weren't taken, and her death was, in that sense, avoidable. We've prosecuted the people in relation to that murder. We've also just arranged the first ever extradition from Iraq, ever, of one of the other people we say were involved in that crime, and he has returned to the country a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and will face trial. So we've gone to town on that prosecution. We want to ensure that anybody remotely involved in her murder pays the penalty. But at the same time, the lessons have to be learnt about the police response there. And so the Association of Chief Police Officers, when they produced their strategy last year, in 2008, did so because they wanted to ensure a consistent and a substantial response on every occasion, not just on any occasion. There wouldn't be this zip code, postcode lottery. Depending on where you are, you get the kind of service you deserve. So the police have learned a great deal from Banaz's case, and so it's sad to say, she had to die for this to happen. But I'm pleased that things have moved on substantially since her death. And to give an example of what we think is right, there's a young woman in West Yorkshire. And she arrived in this country in December 2005 into a marriage which, she was arranged. It wasn't forced as such. And she arrived in the north of England into this marriage, and she was beaten pretty much every day by her husband, to the point where in April 2006, she was dead. And when the coroner looked at her body, he thought she'd been in a car accident. That's how badly she'd been beaten every day for the best part of 5 months. Now, again, from my point of view, it's easy to prosecute the husband for her murder, no problem at all, convicted, life sentence. But it's occurred to us, the police and ourselves, we thought, hang on a minute, she's living with a mother-in-law, 2 sisters-in-law and a brother-in-law. Well, what do they do in this scenario? And so we had some legislation enacted in this country in 2004. And we thought about that legislation. The legislation was simply, we had a number of cases historically where a child dies in the presence of a mother and a father. Mother says father did it, father says mother did it. And we could never prove who did it, and therefore they both escaped. So the legislation was enacted, which basically says if you are in the house and somebody dies in your care, then you are guilty of an offence and you can go to prison for 14 years. And so we thought to ourselves, well, that legislation was really aimed at young children, but we thought, well, hang on a minute, this woman was vulnerable. Sabia Rani was vulnerable. She didn't know anybody in this country. She didn't know the language. She had no access to services. She was stuck at home, imprisoned at home for 5 months. Now, surely the legislation could be extended somewhat to cover that situation. And I think it was a very brave decision, decided to go down that route against the rest of her family, and they were convicted. And now they're in prison too. So the message there is, don't stand by and allow this to happen. You can't say it wasn't me, it was him. If you could have done something about it, then you were as guilty as the person who did the act. And I think that in itself is a great message to send out. And we're very good at our media strategy and communication strategy. Whenever we have a successful prosecution and conviction, we make sure that everybody becomes aware of it, because we want to ensure that it acts as a deterrent, firstly, and secondly, that it acts as a catalyst for people who might be victims or potential victims to think, yes, they are taking this seriously, and therefore I need to do something about my situation and come forward. We recognise that some people who carry out these types of crime actually, and the communities around them, actually revel in it. I remember when Banaz was murdered, we heard stories of people in Iraq jubilant about her death. We also know that when the trial was taking place of those who killed her, that some women in this country were coming into refuges and women's centres and saying, "My family have said I'll be the next Banaz." So, you know, the family or families and communities were actually using Banaz's murder almost as a threat to their own children. So when Banaz's people were convicted and people were extradited, we have to be clear about the level of our commitment to ensure justice is done. Because that's a means of us sending out a message saying, you know, they're saying, ha ha, we did it. We're saying, this is what happens to you if you do it. And I think it's important to send out those messages.